It's 11:47 on a cold Friday night in Bradford. The rain hasn't stopped for hours. The streets shine black under the orange glow of the lampposts, and the city has gone quiet, the way northern cities do after closing time. A low hum of distant traffic, the occasional shout from a doorway, the steady patter of water on pavement. The kind of night you've stood in 100 times if you've ever lived in Britain. A young woman steps out of a pub on the corner. She pulls her coat tight against the cold and lifts her hand toward the curb. Within seconds, a small saloon car slows beside her, its yellow roof light glowing softly through the drizzle. She doesn't ask its name. She doesn't check an app. She just opens the back door and slides inside, the way people in this country have done on streets like this one for 50 years. The interior smells faintly of air freshener and warm engine. A tasbih hangs from the rearview mirror, swaying gently as the car pulls away. The radio dispatcher crackles through the speaker, a woman's voice calling out "streetlight," and clipped against it, just below the windscreen, is a small plastic license card. A photo names, a man's voice answering in clipped reply. The dashboard glows under the cabin lithograph, a name printed beneath. And there it is, a name that appears again and again and again across this country. Khan, or Hussein, or Ahmed, or Malik, or Rashid, or one of a small handful of surnames you'll meet from Glasgow to Luton, from the back streets of Manchester to the night ranks of East London. If you've ever booked a minicab in Britain, you've probably seen them too, not just on the dashboard. Today, in some of Britain's largest cities, more than half of all private hire drivers are of Pakistani origin. In Bradford, the figure is even higher. In parts of Birmingham, Luton, and Rochdale, 8 out of every 10 minicabs on the road are driven by men with roots in a single, small region of South Asia. By the early 2000s, 1 in every 7 Pakistani men in Britain was working behind a steering wheel for a living. It's not a profession, it's a community. In London alone, around 14% of all private hire drivers come from one ethnic group, despite Pakistanis making up less than 3% of the country's population. And here's where the story gets stranger. Most of those drivers don't just trace back to Pakistan. They trace back to one specific corner of it, a small, mountainous district in Pakistan-administered Kashmir called Mirpur. An estimated 60 to 70% of British Pakistanis come from this single region, a place so deeply tied to Britain that locals call it Mini London. So how did one community, from one rural valley, end up running an entire layer of British transport? How did the descendants of Kashmiri farmers come to dominate the night roads of cities they had never seen? And why did it all start with a flooded village 4,000 miles away? Tonight, we're traveling from a drowning valley in Kashmir to the rain-soaked streets of northern England to understand how migration quietly redraws the economic map of a country. The Pakistani taxi story begins long before the first minicab radio crackled to life in a Bradford office. It begins on the open sea. In the early 20th century, decades before Pakistan even existed as a country, men from the Mirpur district were leaving home to work the engine rooms of British merchant ships. They sailed out of Bombay and Karachi, shoveling coal in the suffocating heat below deck. The work was brutal, the pay was thin. But the ships docked in places like Liverpool, Glasgow, and South Shields. And not every sailor was rehired for the return journey. Some were left behind on British soil with no money, no papers, and no way home. Others jumped ship to escape the conditions. They became Britain's first Pakistani settlers, silent, scattered, and almost invisible. Then came the Second World War. Britain emerged victorious, but exhausted. Its mills, foundries, and bus depots were starving for workers. The government quietly opened the door to its former colonial subjects, and Mirpuri men, already familiar with the route through family stories of the old sailors, began to arrive. They went where the work was: the textile mills of Bradford, the wool factories of Yorkshire, the car plants of the West Midlands. They worked the night shifts that nobody else wanted, sleeping 10 to a room in cold terraced houses, sending nearly every pound back to families in Kashmir. But the real turning point came in 1961. That year, the Pakistani government broke ground on one of the largest earth-filled dams in the world, the Mangla Dam. The reservoir would supply water and electricity to millions.
The governor of West Pakistan accompanied the royal party, from the past to the future. A promise of plenty in the waters contained by the Wasak Dam on the Kabul River. The Queen came to see one of the most dramatic results of Pakistan's first 5-year plan. This dam, built with assistance from Canada under the Colombo Plan, has been described as a monument to the friendship between the two countries. It's also a monument to Pakistan's determination in tackling her problems. Besides power for the new industries, it'll bring water to many thousands of barren acres.
But to build it, they had to flood the valley below. Over 250 villages disappeared beneath the water. The entire old town of Mirpur was submerged. More than 100,000 people were displaced from land their families had farmed for generations. There was compensation, there were resettlement schemes, and through agreements tied to British contractors involved in the project, there were UK visas. Around 5,000 displaced Mirpuris boarded planes to a country they had never seen, joining cousins already working the mills. It was supposed to be temporary. Earn enough money, send it home. Return when the new town was built. Almost none of them ever returned. Because once a man from Mirpur was settled in Bradford, his brother followed. Then his cousin. Then his nephew. Then the cousin of his nephew's wife. The British call it chain migration. The Mirpuris just called it family. Within a decade, entire villages in Kashmir had emptied themselves into northern English cities. And the small handful of stranded sailors from the 1920s had become a community of hundreds of thousands, still working the mills, still sending money home, still waiting for the day their fortunes would change. That day was coming, but not in the way they expected. For nearly 2 decades, the Mirpuri men of Bradford and Birmingham had a deal with Britain. They worked the jobs nobody else wanted, and Britain let them stay. But by the late 1970s, that deal was quietly breaking down. The textile mills that had pulled them across the world were closing one by one. Cheaper cotton was coming from Asia. Automation was wiping out the night shifts. The foundries of the Midlands were going dark. And then came Margaret Thatcher and the brutal industrial reforms of the 1980s.
To those waiting with bated breath for that favorite media catchphrase, the U-turn, I have only one thing to say. U-turn if you want to.
The mill chimneys stopped smoking. Redundancy notices arrived in thousands of homes across Bradford, Rochdale, and Luton. For Mirpuri men in their 40s and 50s, men who had spent their whole working lives at a loom or a furnace, who spoke limited English, who had no British qualifications, the future suddenly looked like nothing at all. But there was one business with almost no barrier to entry: a car, a council license, a radio. The 1980s saw the rise of the British Minicab, a deregulated, low-cost private hire industry that needed no formal training, no degree, no English fluency beyond the basics. For thousands of out-of-work Mirpuri men, it was the only door still open. And once one driver passed the test and bought his first second-hand Datsun, he told his cousin, who told his brother, who told his neighbor from the same village back in Kashmir. But there was one major obstacle. Even a second-hand car, a license, and a radio rental cost money. And most of these men had no savings, no credit history, and no relationship with a high street bank. British banks looked at unemployed mill workers with names they couldn't pronounce and quietly turned them away. So the community built its own bank. The Mirpuris had brought something with them from the rural valleys of Kashmir, a centuries-old social system called biradari, the patrilineal brotherhood. Biradari meant your cousin's debt was your debt. It meant a man's word, given in his own kitchen, was stronger than any contract written by a London solicitor. Need £3,000 for your first taxi and license? Your uncle in Bradford lends £1,000. Your cousin in Luton wires £800. Your father-in-law's brother in Birmingham covers the rest. No paperwork, no interest, just birottery. Pay it back when you can. And when your nephew arrives next year from Mirpur, you'll do exactly the same for him. It was a 1,000-year-old credit network that the City of London never noticed, and it financed an entire industry. And once the car was on the road, another quiet advantage took over. A British-owned firm paid drivers, dispatchers, mechanics, cleaners. A Mirpuri-owned firm ran on family. The father drove nights, the brother drove days, the cousin worked the radio. The nephew, fresh off the plane, washed the cars between shifts. The wife answered the office phone from the kitchen. The teenage son did the books after his GCSE homework, sometimes falling asleep on a plastic chair in the office while waiting for his dad's shift to end. Nobody was paid a wage. Everybody ate from the same pot. Labor cost was almost zero. And that single difference, that the family was the business, meant a Mirpuri firm could undercut a British one by 40% and still make a profit. Within a decade, on city after city across northern England, that quiet advantage had reshaped an entire industry. But as Pakistani drivers spread across Britain's night roads, so did the attention, and not all of it was welcoming. Customers walked past Mirpuri-driven cabs to wait for a white driver. Tabloids ran headlines that quietly stitched the words taxi driver and Pakistani together as if they were the same thing. After the 7/7 London bombings of 2005, the suspicion sharpened into something colder. Sideways looks, refused fares, late-night insults shouted through open windows.
Big white appeared, and then it was just smoke everywhere. In the tunnel, we was trying to close the doors because it was just smoke, we couldn't breathe.
Some drivers responded with small Union Jack stickers on their dashboards, not as patriotism, as protection. The grooming gang scandals of the 2000s in Rotherham and Rochdale poured fuel on the fire. A whole community of working men found themselves answering for crimes they had never committed in cities they had built with their own labor. And yet, the empire kept growing. Today, Pakistani-owned firms hold city contracts across Bradford, Birmingham, and Luton. The school runs, the hospital transfers, the council-tendered private hire. Some families that started with one second-hand Datsun in 1979 now run fleets of 200 cars and stakes in the app platforms competing with Uber. But something else has changed. The children who once slept on plastic chairs in their father's minicab offices have grown up. They are NHS consultants now, barristers in the City of London, members of Parliament. Sadiq Khan, the mayor of London, is the son of a bus driver from Pakistan. The taxi was never the goal. The taxi was the runway. Late tonight, somewhere on a rainy street in Britain, a hand will rise at the curb. A small saloon will slow through the drizzle, its yellow light glowing softly. Behind the wheel will be a man whose grandfather walked out of a drowning valley in Kashmir 60 years ago, carrying nothing but a family name and a debt to be repaid. The license card on his dashboard will read Khan, or Hussein, or Ahmed. Their grandparents were forced to leave land that was disappearing beneath water. Their grandchildren now drive across cities that never sleep. City by city, fare by fare, mile by mile. The next time you book a minicab in Britain, take a look at the dashboard. You might notice a familiar name.